Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. I'm so glad you've joined me this evening because I've got a fabulous story for you that you're really going to love. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel because I have got so many equally stunning stories lined up for you to listen to. And if you're like me, there is nothing that beats a good story before you go to bed. So let's get started. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, I believe my grandfather may have had a friendship with a Bigfoot because growing up the signs were all there and I was too blind to see them, which I really regret. I was raised by my mother in a small little townhouse in Atlanta. I was born as a result of a teenage pregnancy and I'm grateful my mother chose to keep me. It could not have been easy for her because my father absconded and never wanted to have to do anything with me. My mother would always send me to rural Kentucky during the school holidays to stay with my grandfather, and every holiday I spent with my granddad was simply wonderful. He lived on a large property of 250 acres of land with its own lake, boathouse and woods. It was every young boy's dream, and I recall countless wonderful summer holidays with him. My grandfather was an outdoorsy type of person, and he would take me canoeing on the lake, fishing, camping and exploring. I loved spending time with him because he was so easygoing, down to earth, and the kind of person that really understood animals like no one I have ever known. And whether a creature was wild or domestic, they trusted him. One year during the summer holidays, I brought my best friend Ben to stay at my granddad's house. Ben was a light sleeper, unlike myself, and so one night he woke me up, shaking my body violently. "Rex," he said, "your grandfather is up to something." "What are you talking about?" I asked him, wiping the sleep from my eyes. "He's doing some kind of Morse code downstairs." "What do you mean?" I asked. Ben took me to the bedroom window that looked across the lower living quarters of the house, and I could see the outline of my grandfather in the window, flashing his torch 3 times on, 3 times off, 3 times on and 3 times off. It did seem very odd, to say the least. What was my grandfather up to, I wondered? Who on earth was he signalling to? I began to feel as if I was in the middle of an Enid Blyton adventure, and it was exciting for a boy of my age. Suddenly we heard 3 distinct whistles coming from the woods, followed by 3 wood knocks. Then there were 3 more whistles, 3 more wood knocks, and finally 3 whistles and 3 wood knocks. Once again my grandfather repeated his torch action 3 times off, 1 times on. Then we saw the outline of 3 huge, dark, formidable looking shapes emerging from the woods at the back of the property. If you did not know better, you could even have thought that the beings were ghosts because of the way they almost floated across the lawn towards my grandfather with such swiftness and ease. "Boy, they look creepy," gasped Ben in horror. "Did you see the red shine coming from those creatures' eyes? Do you think your granddad is involved in the occult? These things look like devils that your grandfather has summoned. And look, one of them is carrying a deer on his shoulders." "Don't be silly," I scolded Ben. Secretly, I was wondering why my grandfather's behavior was so mysterious. What was he hiding? What did he not want us to see? And what were these strange, gargantuan, dark forms that he seemed to have summoned from the forest? Ben and I could hear excitable chattering going on as the creatures conversed with my granddad in this strange language, and I could hear my grandfather chattering back in the same tongue. Ben and I watched in amazement as these creatures finally returned to the woods in the same way that they had come. The question left us haunted because these creatures looked like the stuff that nightmares were made of, and yet my grandfather was talking to them as if they were friends. It was weird, to say the least. "I'm sorry," said Ben, "but those things, whatever they are, they look like demons." The next morning I was too cowardly to ask my granddad directly who his nightly visitors were, which all these years later I truly regret, because my grandfather was a very straightforward person, and I believe he would have told me, or I think he would have told me the whole truth. I watched my grandfather prepare a venison stew for dinner, with the deer the creatures brought him. I asked him, "Where did you get that deer?" A friend of mine who's a hunter dropped it by last night. I never saw him, I lied. He's always an impromptu visitor, said my grandfather. Why, I asked. Some people like to keep themselves to themselves. Do you have to pay him for the deer? Of course not, laughed my father. It was a gift. He must be very generous, I said. His kind are, he said, if you treat them right. So that was one occasion for me when the dots just did not add up, and Ben and I would spend ages together discussing the strange-looking ghostly apparition-like forms that we had seen visiting my granddad. Another time I was staying at my grandfather's house, I remember he fought tooth and nail with the authorities regarding some of the forests in his area that were going to be flattened to make way for modern housing. I had never seen my grandfather angrier in his whole life. He got people to sign petitions from all over North America against destroying these vast areas of natural habitat, and he literally got millions of signatures. I do not know how he did it, but he won the case. And I'm glad to say that even all these years later, that area my grandfather fought for has not been flattened, but remains an area of protected natural beauty and abundant wildlife. I remember asking him why preserving the forest was so important to him, and he said, "Son, these forests are a natural habitat for many animals, many that you may not even know about. How would you feel if your home was being snatched away from under you?" I would hate it, I told him. He said to me, "Some creatures don't have a voice. We need to be that voice for them." People do not truly understand animals because they do not speak their language. If they understood the way that animals feel and think, just like we do, the world would be a better place because there would be so much more compassion. After that conversation with my granddad, I stayed with him over the years for many more holidays until I finally went to university. In those days, I did not stay with him in Kentucky, but spoke to him very regularly on the phone. 20 years passed by very quickly, and in that time I got married to a wonderful woman called Allison, and we had a baby girl called Abigail together. Sadly, my mum passed away 5 years earlier due to a malignant form of breast cancer, so she never got to meet her beautiful grandchild, which is a dreadful pity. On one very sad morning in early fall, I was informed that my grandfather had died of a sudden stroke at his home. I was totally devastated, and all the memories of my childhood came flooding back. All the time I had spent with him, especially the memories of those dark forms that emerged from the woods. All these years later, I still wondered what they were. Naturally, I was the only surviving family member left to deal with all the funeral arrangements. In Kentucky, you can get buried on a family plot, and my grandfather wanted to be buried next to his deceased wife, whose gravestone had been on the family plot for over 40 years. I began to make funeral arrangements, and there were so many people who came to the service, which was conducted around an open grave. I was amazed how beloved my grandfather was, because there was not a dry eye in the house, quite literally. My wife and I invited everyone to join us for a hog roast with salads and drinks to honor the memory of my grandfather. One lady came up to me and told me how wonderful my grandfather was. "Of course," she said, "he knew the animals like no one else I've ever known. He could talk to them, you know, and they would talk back." "What do you mean?" I asked in surprise. The lady looked at me. "You don't know?" "Know what?" I asked. "That everyone around here would call on your grandfather if they were having problems with an animal. He would go and see the animal and talk to it telepathically." "You mean like an animal psychic?" I asked. "Exactly," she said. "I had a cat that was not eating, and I found out that she wanted to eat in private without the dogs watching her because it made her feel uncomfortable and self-conscious. You see, I would feed them in the kitchen together." "Did it work?" I asked. "From the moment I fed him away from those dogs, that cat started to eat at once and regained the weight that she had lost. I was so relieved, and it was all thanks to your granddad." Believe you me, I could tell you some stories of the wonderful thing that your granddad has done for animals around this area. Suddenly at the funeral gathering, I learned things about my grandfather that I had never known, and I marveled over him from beyond the grave. Once the funeral service was over, and I was washing dishes at the kitchen sink that had a great view over our family burial plot, I noticed the signs of the early evening approaching as the light started to dissipate. It was then that I saw 3 forms coming from the woods, walking with such great grace towards my grandfather's grave. They looked very similar to the huge shapes I had seen all those years ago as a young boy. But now that it was lighter, I got a clearer view of them. I could see by the way that these creatures were gathered around my grandfather's gravesite that they were really grieving my granddad's passing. What were they, I wondered, as I watched the creatures in awe. They were all about 8 feet tall, 800 pounds, and their bodies were covered in 3-inch long black hair. They had long arms like a monkey's, only they were hugely muscular, and hands like a human, and their torso area was huge, but the legs were lean and strong. They did have human-like faces, set in cone-shaped heads. Their eyes I could not see clearly, but their noses looked flat and their lips slim. Suddenly I heard high-pitched howling sounds coming from these creatures that were so shrill it almost made my whole body vibrate. And I kid you not, the sound was terrifying, although I don't think they meant it to be that way. Finally and thankfully the howling stopped, and then for a long while they stood in silence as if they were honouring my grandfather. At face value, these creatures were terrifying and exceedingly formidable, but they clearly had a humanity to them, and I believe had a good relationship with my granddad. How that all transpired, I will never know because my grandfather never told me about it. However, from all that I've learnt about my grandfather's psychic ability with animals, I began to understand that my grandfather really did have some kind of a personal relationship with the creature that I now know to be Bigfoot. And maybe my grandfather was the one person that knew how to speak the language of the hairy man. I do hope you enjoyed the story. Thank you so very much for that lovely story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.